Hi everyone, Dr. Mackenbell here. Welcome to the Module 1 Activity Overview video. In today's video, we are going to make sense of food labels. So we are going to take the information that's provided on a food label and see how that food item or meal fits into our acceptable macronutrient density range and our daily balanced diet. You're going to be doing the same activity for your Module 1 activity where you will assess the nutrient content of a meal. So in today's video, we are going to begin by reviewing some of that nutrient information for each of those 3 energy supplying nutrients. Then we're going to get into some of the calculations that you will be doing in your module activity. So we're going to calculate the nutrient information for a food item, and then we're going to see how that nutrient information of that food item fits into the daily recommended diet of an individual. So let's begin by reviewing some of the information we saw in the previous videos. First of all, we know that there are 3 primary energy supplying nutrients. We call these macronutrients. The first of which is carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are our primary source of energy. They are composed of simple sugars called monosaccharides. For every gram of carbohydrate that we eat, we receive 4 calories of energy. Our other primary source of energy is going to come from the second macronutrient, which is called lipids, or more often called fats. Fats are composed of a glycerol molecule with 1 or more fatty acid chains attached. Fats are a tremendous source of energy, very efficient, so for every gram of fat that we eat, we get 9 calories of energy. And finally, the third macronutrient is protein. Proteins are primarily used to build and repair tissue, but can also be a source of energy. Proteins are composed of amino acids, and similar to carbohydrates, for every gram of protein, we receive 4 calories of energy. In the previous lesson, we also discussed something called the Acceptable Macronutrient Density Range, the AMDR. The AMDR gives us guidelines about how much of our diet should be composed of carbohydrates, how much should be composed of lipids and fats, and how much should be composed of proteins. We know that carbohydrates should compose the primary part of our diet. The majority of our calories should be carbohydrates. In fact, 45 to 65% of our calories should be from carbohydrates. Fiber is one particular type of carbohydrate that I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail at the end of today's video. Lipids and fats should compose about 20 to 35% of our diet. However, saturated fats, one type of fat which we're going to discuss in a little bit more detail, should compose less than 10% of our daily total calories. I want to make a note that's less than 10% of our daily total calories, not less than 10% of our fat calories. That's something that students often confuse. Finally, protein should account for 10 to 35% of our daily total calories. Our daily total calories are going to vary upon a number of factors, and so there's going to be 3 primary factors that we're going to look at when determining how many calories an individual should be consuming per day. So the first factor is going to be your gender. Men tend to need more calories per day than women. The second factor is going to be our age. So we see we have the highest calorie needs when we're in our adolescence and early adulthood years. As we age, we need less and less calories, usually. Finally, the third factor is pretty obvious, and that's going to be how many calories are we actually burning. So we're going to look at that activity level. Someone who's sedentary doesn't need as many calories as someone who is moderately active, and they're not going to need as many calories as someone who is extremely active. So let's look at what the daily total calories would be for your typical college student. So if we were to look at a moderately active female who is 19 to 20 years old, she's going to need about 2,200 calories per day. Now let's compare that to a moderately active male, the same age. He's going to need about 2,800 calories per day. So we can use this information to assess how many calories of carbohydrates, how many calories of fat, and how many calories of protein we should be eating each day. For your Module 1 activity, I'm going to have you guys look at a meal and assess how well that meal fits into the recommendations for a typical college student's diet. In order to do this, you're going to need 2 pieces of information. The first piece of information is going to be how many calories of carbohydrates, how many calories of fat, and how many calories of protein should that typical college student be consuming on a daily basis. The second piece of information is going to be specific to that food item or that meal. So we're going to need to look at that food item or that meal and see how many calories of carbohydrates, how many calories of fat, and how many calories of protein are in that food item or that meal. We can then compare the content of that food item to the total daily calories, and we can get an idea of how much their carbohydrates, how much of their fats, and how much of their protein they're getting from that specific snack or that specific meal. So let's look at a specific example. We're going to consider that 19 to 20-year-old moderately active woman who should be eating 2,200 calories per day. Let's see how we can calculate how many carbohydrates, how many fats, and how many protein calories she should be eating. The AMDR is a range, so we're going to see that 45 to 65% recommendation for carbohydrates. For the purpose of this activity, we are going to pick a specific number within each of those ranges, and that is how we are going to do our calculations. You are more than welcome to adjust these numbers based off of your personal preferences. So if you are someone who is wanting to minimize the amount of carbohydrates in your diet and maximize the amount of protein you're consuming, that is okay to choose numbers lower than the ones that I have selected. However, the numbers that you choose must fall within that AMDR range. So you should not choose any lower than 45% of your calories from carbohydrate, nor any higher than 35% of your calories from protein. For the purpose of this activity, we are going to examine this woman's diet if she is trying to eat 60% of her calories from carbohydrates, 20% from fats, and 20% from protein. That saturated fat should always remain below 10%. So if we want to see how many specific calories of carbohydrates, how many specific calories of fat, and how many specific calories of saturated fat, how many specific calories of protein the 19 to 20-year-old moderately active woman should be eating, we can look at her total daily calories, that 2,200, and times those by those percentages that we have selected. So what that's going to look like is this. We know that she's supposed to be eating 2,200 calories per day, and that 60% or 0.06 of those should be carbohydrate calories. So we're going to take 2,200 times 0.6. That's going to give us 1,320 calories of carbs. We can repeat that same process for each of the other macronutrients. So 20% should be fat. So we're going to see 2,200 times 0.2 gives us 440 calories of fats. We also know that less than 10% of her total calories should come from saturated fats. So less than 10% of her 2,200 daily calories should be saturated fat. And that's going to give us less than 220 calories of saturated fat. Finally, we can repeat the same process for protein. Once again, it's 2,200 calories of her total daily calories times 20% or 0.2, which once again gives us 440 calories of protein. So per day, she should be eating about 1,320 calories of carbohydrates, 440 calories of fat, and 440 calories of protein. Now that we have calculated the number of calories from each of the 3 macronutrients she should be consuming on a daily basis, we can compare this to the nutrient content of a particular food item or a meal. In today's video, we are going to focus on one food item. So I have selected a coffee cake from a popular coffee chain. So we're going to look at this piece of classic coffee cake and take a closer look at the nutrient content of it. We're going to look at the food label, and the food label is going to give us the grams of each of these 3 macronutrients. So you can see on the slide that I've inserted an arrow next to some of the nutrients that I want you guys to pay special attention to. We can see that there are 15 grams of total fat in this, including 8 grams of saturated fat. So 8 of those 15 grams are saturated fat. We also can see that there's 43 grams of carbohydrates in this coffee cake, and we can see that there's only 1 gram of fiber, and finally we can see that there's 4 grams of protein. In order to assess how this item actually fits in her AMDR, we're going to go through 2 steps. And the first step is we're going to calculate the total calories for each of the 3 macronutrients in the food items. So this is what that's going to look like. So the nutrition label for our coffee cake tells us that that piece of coffee cake includes 15 grams of fat. It also includes 8 grams of saturated fat. So of those 15, 8 are saturated fat. Additionally, it includes 43 grams of carbohydrates, and then finally 4 grams of protein. So how can we take these grams and convert those into calories so we can compare the calories of fat, the calories of carbohydrates, and the calories of protein to the amount of calories that she should be eating on a daily basis of each of those macronutrients. So we can do some simple calculations using the information that we know about fats, carbohydrates, and protein. So if we know that there's 15 grams of fat in the coffee cake, we're going to take those 15 grams. We also know that for every 1 gram of fat, we have 9 calories of energy. So we're going to do a simple multiplication problem. Our grams cross out, we're left with calories, and that gives us 135 calories of fat. We'll repeat the same process for each of the rest of the nutrients. So we have 8 grams of saturated fat. Saturated fat is a type of fat, so we know there's 9 calories per 1 gram. And that's going to give us 72 calories of saturated fat. You see that our grams cross out and we're left with calories. Now, most of our calories are looking like they're going to come from carbohydrates because we have 43 grams of carbohydrates in this piece of coffee cake. We know that for every 1 gram of carbohydrates, we have 4 calories. So we're going to take 43 times 4, and we're going to get our total calories of carbohydrate, which is going to be 172 calories of carbohydrates. Finally, we're going to repeat the same process with proteins. So we have only 4 grams of protein in this piece of coffee cake. For every gram of protein, we have 4 calories, just like carbohydrates. So we're going to do our 4 grams times our 4 calories, and that is going to give us 16 total calories of protein in this coffee cake. So that is how we converted our grams from our nutrition label into the calories that we will need to compare to her total AMDR. So now we're ready for the second step. Now we are going to compare the total caloric content in the food item for each of the 3 macronutrients to her total AMDR for each of those macronutrients. So for example, we could look at the total number of calories of protein that are in that coffee cake and divide that or compare that to the total number of calories of protein she should eat on a daily basis. We're going to multiply this by 100 so that we can see what percentage of her daily calories this item accounts for. And this is what that's going to look like. So now we can take that information that we've learned about the total number of calories of carbohydrates, the total number of calories of fat, the total number of calories of saturated fat, and the total number of calories of protein that are in that piece of coffee cake, and compare that to the total number of calories of each of those macronutrients she should be eating on a daily basis. This information is going to give us a little bit of a description or an idea about how well that piece of coffee cake fits into a recommended balanced diet. So let's look at carbohydrates first. We saw that there was 172 calories of carbohydrates in the coffee cake. We're going to compare that to her 1,320 calories of carbohydrates that she should eat on a daily basis. I'm going to times it by 100, and that's going to give us the percentage of her daily carbohydrates that are in this coffee cake. That's going to tell us that she's consumed about 13% of her daily intake of carbohydrates. We're going to repeat this process for fat. We'll look specifically at saturated fat, and then finally we'll look at protein. So we saw that there was 135 calories of fat in this piece of coffee cake. We also know that she should eat about 440 calories of fat every day. If we times this by 100, we can see that this coffee cake gives her about 31% of her total daily fat. Let's look at that saturated fat a little closer. So we know that there were 72 calories of saturated fat, and that she should eat less than 220 calories of saturated fat per day. Once again, we're going to times that by 100, and that's going to tell us that about 33% of her maximum amount of saturated fat calories were in that piece of coffee cake. Finally, we'll look at protein, and we'll see that there's only about 16 calories of protein out of the 440 total that she should eat per day. We'll times that by 100, and we'll see that that coffee cake only contributed about 4% of her daily calories of protein. So she can use this information to kind of guide what she's going to eat the rest of the day. Maybe she's accounted for a large portion of her fat, so she wants to choose lower fat foods. She hasn't accounted for very much of her protein and not too much of her carbohydrates, so maybe she's going to choose foods that are higher in carbohydrates and protein. Now that we've done one together, I want you to practice one on your own. We're going to keep that same food item, but this time, instead of a 19 to 20-year-old moderately active woman eating it, we're going to change who's eating that coffee cake. So now we're going to consider that it's a 19 to 20-year-old moderately active male. And what's different between that woman and that man is the number of calories they should be eating on a daily basis. So although the nutrient content of the coffee cake doesn't change, what's going to change is our denominator. So he's going to have to eat more calories of carbohydrates, more calories of protein, and more calories of fat on a daily basis. So that's going to change those percentages that we originally calculated. So at this point, I want you guys to pause the video, and then when you've calculated the percentage of his carbohydrates, the percentage of his daily fats, and the percentage of his daily protein that that coffee cake makes up, then restart the video and compare your answers to mine. In order to answer that question, you're going to need to go through two steps. The first step is to calculate the number of calories from carbohydrates, fats, saturated fats, and proteins he should be eating on a daily basis based off of that 2,800 calories per day dietary guidelines. So we're going to repeat the same process that we did when we were talking about that young woman. So we know that he's supposed to eat 2,800 calories per day. So we're going to times that 2,800 times 0.6. So you should have had 1,680 calories from carbohydrates, 560 calories of fats, less than 280 calories from saturated fats per day, and then finally 560 calories from protein per day. That's going to give us that denominator piece of the equation that we're going to need in order to compare the nutrient content of the coffee cake to his AMDR. So that was the second part that you were going to need to do to answer the question. So we're just going to repeat that same process that we did with the young woman, and we're going to see that that coffee cake supplied 172 calories of carbohydrates compared to the 1,680 he should be eating on a daily basis. We times that by 100, and this is going to give us the percent of carbohydrate calories this coffee cake contains for his diet. So he's getting 10% of his daily carbohydrates from this coffee cake. Same process with fats, so 135 calories over 560 total calories times 100. The coffee cake is about 24% of his daily fat calories and 26% of his saturated fat calories. Finally, protein, there's only about 3% of his daily protein calories in that piece of coffee cake. If you didn't find these answers, make sure that you go back and review the section on how we did these calculations with the young woman, and then try again. Before we conclude today's video, I want to draw your attention to a couple of special considerations. The first is saturated fat, and we've been talking about this throughout the entire video. So I've told you guys that we should be keeping our saturated fat to less than 10% of our total daily calories. This is because we know that diets high in saturated fat are associated with numerous negative health outcomes, including high cholesterol and heart disease. Foods that typically contain a lot of saturated fat include processed meats and cheeses, as you see in the picture beside me. The other nutrient that I want to pay special attention to is fiber. And fiber is a type of carbohydrate. What's unique about fiber is that typically most Americans receive the adequate or an overabundant amount of each of the recommended nutrients. Fiber is one nutrient that we are not receiving enough of typically. So Americans need to consume at least 25 grams of fiber per day. That's going to be for a woman. We're thinking more upwards of 38 grams per day for the typical male. And most Americans are not receiving this amount of fiber in their diet. Foods that are high in fiber tend to be foods like broccoli, lentils, some peas, avocados, other types of fruits and vegetables and grains as well. And the reason that we want to have our diets high in fiber is because research shows us that diets high in fiber are associated with positive health outcomes, such as a reduced risk for obesity, a reduced risk for some cancers, and a reduced risk for diabetes and heart disease. So we've now come to the end of our video. In this video, we looked at the nutrient content of one specific food item. However, it's rare that we're just eating one food item at a time. Normally, we're eating a whole meal, so that might consist of a drink that obviously contains calories, some sort of protein or main dish. There might be a side or two sides, and maybe even a dessert in there as well. So for the Module 1 activity, you're going to be examining the nutrient content of an entire meal. And I've selected a list of popular meals at local fast food restaurants. I would recommend that you choose one of the meals on the list that might be something that you actually do eat or would consider eating on a regular basis, so you can apply this information to your own actual lifestyle. To find more information about the assignment, including specific instructions and a grading rubric, you're going to go to our OAKS course page and Module 1, and you're going to select the Do tab, where all of the assessment activities will be for each module. Thank you for watching.